The stench hit me first. It was an acrid, sulfurous smell that clung to the walls of the dim room, seeping into every crack like a malevolent spirit waiting for its moment. No, scratch that, it was a spirit. I knew that now. The air hung thick, almost alive, pressing down on me as I stood there, staring at the stained carpet where the blood had long since dried. The cops had taken care of most of the cleanup, but there are some things you can't clean up. The house seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting in slow, sickening rhythms, as if the very structure was trying to exhale whatever foul presence still lingered inside. I kept telling myself this was just another case, another incident where someone snapped, lost control, crossed that line between sanity and something darker. But deep down I knew better. We all did. Arne had crossed more than a line. The trial was over. The papers called it the "devil made me do it" case. The defense had rolled with it, claiming Arne was under the control of some malevolent force, something that had passed on from that kid, David. I couldn't shake the kid's face from my mind. Sunken eyes, pale skin, always mumbling to himself. He was just a kid, but when you looked in his eyes, it was like staring into an abyss. Something looked back at you. Arne had been there, trying to help, trying to be the protector. A good man, they said. Strong, but strong men fall the hardest when evil wants in. It took him, twisted him, and then it bled him dry. By the time Arne's landlord had been found, his body was barely recognizable, a shredded mess of flesh and bone. The wounds weren't clean. No, they were jagged, torn apart as if something far worse than a human hand had done the work. The official reports didn't say that, but I'd seen enough to know the difference. I remember when Arne sat in that courtroom, his hands shackled, his eyes vacant, like the life had been sucked right out of him. His lawyer called it possession. The prosecutor called it insanity. Me? I wasn't sure what to call it. Not yet. I thought that maybe the trial would be the end. A horrible chapter closed. But the thing about evil, it doesn't just stop. It festers. It lingers. And if you're unlucky enough, it spreads. I wasn't there when Arne screamed in his cell, but I heard the stories. How the guards found him clawing at the walls. How the temperature in that room dropped like someone had opened a door to a winter no one had invited in. That's why I came here to this damn house. I had to see it for myself. People said the evil was gone, that Arne was the only one infected. But when you've seen what I've seen, you know better. Evil doesn't leave. It waits. The floorboards creaked under my feet, every step echoing like a heartbeat in this dead place. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but something wasn't right. There was a pressure building, not just around me, but inside me, like something was slowly wrapping its hands around my throat, squeezing the breath from my lungs. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then nothing. Just darkness. Thick, impenetrable darkness that swallowed the room whole. I didn't panic, not at first. I stood there, still as the dead, listening for something, anything, that would tell me I wasn't alone. Then it came. A whisper. A soft, raspy sound like someone dragging their nails across sandpaper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right next to my ear. I spun around, the flashlight flickering back to life for just a second. And that's when I saw it. A face. Pale, gaunt, twisted in an expression of pure malice. Eyes that weren't eyes at all but black. Hollow pits that seemed to pull the light from the room. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the image burned itself into my brain. I stumbled back, crashing into the wall, heart hammering in my chest. The air grew colder. My breath came out in shaky, visible puffs. The whispering started again, louder this time. Overlapping voices, all of them speaking words I couldn't understand, didn't want to understand. I turned to leave, my hand reaching for the door, but it slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. A low, guttural growl filled the room. Not human, not animal, something worse. My skin crawled, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shadow. It wasn't big, just a sliver of darkness creeping along the floor, inching toward me like a snake ready to strike. My breath caught in my throat as it grew larger, taller, until it was towering over me. I don't know why, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The shadow leaned closer, its form shifting, contorting until it resembled a figure. Not quite human, not quite anything. But I knew what it was. It wasn't Arne. It was the thing that had taken him. The thing that was still here. And it wanted more. My heart slammed against my ribcage, and just when I thought the pressure would crush me, the door behind me swung open. Cold air rushed in, cutting through the suffocating tension. I didn't think. I ran. But as I stumbled down the stairs, tripping over my own feet. I heard it behind me. The whisper, the growl, the sound of something scraping across the floor. It was following me. And no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, I knew it wasn't finished. Not yet. Something had followed me out. The nightmares started almost immediately. Every night, the same suffocating darkness, the same feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. In the dreams, I was always back in that house, standing in the same room where the blood had soaked into the carpet. But it wasn't empty anymore. Arne was there, sitting in the corner, staring at me with those hollow eyes. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. And always behind him was the shadow. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. But worse than the dreams was the feeling that the shadow had followed me back. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a chill that settled in the air, even when the room was warm. It was like the darkness had clung to me, refusing to let go. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, a trick of the mind. After all, I'd been in that house long enough for it to mess with my head, right? That's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd seen it in Arne's eyes before everything went wrong. Once that darkness touches you, it leaves a mark, a permanent one. Days passed, and the whispers began to creep into my waking hours. Soft at first, like a low hum just beneath the noise of everyday life. But then they grew louder, more insistent. I'd be in the middle of a conversation, and there it would be. A voice, raspy and faint, calling my name. At first I thought it was just me cracking under the pressure. But then things started happening. Things I couldn't explain. It began with small stuff. Lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own. My cat, normally calm, would hiss at empty corners of the room, her fur standing on end as she backed away. But then it escalated. One night, I was working late in my office, trying to drown out the whispers with the click of my keyboard. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that sets your nerves on edge. And then from the hallway, I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was the house settling, pipes creaking or the floorboards shifting. But then the steps grew louder, deliberate, moving toward me. The air turned icy, and I felt that same suffocating presence I had felt back in the house. My fingers froze on the keyboard. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't look. The footsteps stopped just behind me. The air was so cold I could see my breath. I could feel it, standing there, just inches away from me, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I had no choice. Slowly, I turned. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the cold lingered, pressing against my skin like icy fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching me from the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Arne's face, his hollow, lifeless eyes staring back at me. And behind him, the shadow. Always the shadow. A few days later, I got a call from someone who had worked on Arne's case. A priest. He had been involved with the exorcism that was supposed to help David, the kid Arne had been protecting. We'd never spoken before, but his voice was urgent, almost frantic. "We need to meet," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you need to know." I met him at a diner just outside town. He was an older man, face lined with years of seeing things no one should ever have to see. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He got straight to the point. "It's not over," he said, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected something to be lurking in the shadows. "What happened to Arne? What happened to David? It doesn't just go away." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean?" "The demon," he said, leaning in close, his voice low and trembling. "It wasn't bound to the boy. It wasn't even bound to Arne. It was looking for a host, someone to carry it. And once it finds someone, it never lets go." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying it's with you now," he whispered. "It's been with you since you stepped foot in that house. It's watching you, waiting." The room seemed to tilt, my vision blurring for a second as a cold sweat broke out on my skin. I wanted to argue, to call him crazy, but deep down, I knew he was right. I had felt it, hadn't I? That cold presence, those whispers in the dark. It had followed me. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The priest shook his head, his eyes filled with a sorrow I hadn't seen before. "There's no stopping it. It's too late for that." Suddenly, the lights in the diner flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. The priest's face went pale, and his hand shot out, grabbing my arm with a grip like iron. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rising in desperation. "You need to be careful. It will come for you when you're most vulnerable. when your guard is down. And when it does, the lights flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw it, a shadow, just beyond the priest's shoulder, creeping toward him like a living thing. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could say anything, the lights went out completely. The diner was plunged into darkness, and then a scream. A sound so guttural, so full of terror that it chilled me to my core. The lights flickered back on, and when they did, the priest was gone. Just gone. No trace of him. No blood. No body. Nothing. I stumbled out of the diner, heart racing, my mind reeling. The demon was playing with me. It had him. And I knew I was next. That night, the whispers didn't just haunt my dreams. They spoke to me, and they called me by name. I couldn't shake the priest's words. It's with you now. The drive home was a blur of headlights and shadows, my mind a fog of fear and disbelief. The demon was playing games. It had taken the priest right in front of me, and now it was waiting for its next move, stalking me like prey. By the time I reached my house, the night felt unnaturally still. No wind, no distant hum of passing cars, just an oppressive silence, thick and suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. The air itself felt wrong, like something was twisting it into something unrecognizable. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me as if a simple deadbolt could keep out what was coming. The house felt different now. No longer a sanctuary, it was more like a cage. The shadows seemed to crawl along the walls, slithering into corners that light couldn't reach. My breathing was shallow, every sound amplified, every creak of the floorboard sending my heart into my throat. I wasn't alone, I knew that much. The whispers were no longer just faint echoes in the back of my mind. They were constant now, a low murmur just beneath the surface of my thoughts. Sometimes they overlapped, voices blending together in a symphony of dread. Sometimes they called my name, the sound distorted, like something imitating a human voice but not quite getting it right. "Come closer," one voice hissed from the dark. I froze, staring into the hallway where the shadows gathered thickest. "We've been waiting for you," another whispered, from the opposite side of the room. My head snapped in that direction, heart hammering against my chest. I backed into the living room, my hands shaking. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the house. But where could I go? It was with me. Everywhere I turned, it followed. There was no escape. Then came the thud, a heavy, sickening sound from upstairs. My stomach twisted in knots. Something was in my bedroom. No, someone. Against my better judgment, I took a step forward. The floor groaned beneath me, the only sound breaking the silence. Slowly, I ascended the stairs, each creak of the wood making my skin crawl. The hallway was dark, too dark. My bedroom door was ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling out into the hall. And something told me that whatever waited behind that door was no longer human. Another thud, then a shuffle, like something dragging itself across the floor. I reached the top of the stairs, my breath catching in my throat. The door creaked as I pushed it open. My hand trembled as I flicked on the light, but it flickered, sputtering in and out of life. That's when I saw it. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The shape on the floor, it was twisted, contorted in a way no body should be able to bend. Limbs bent backward, skin pulled tight over bone. Its face, once human, now a grotesque mask of terror. Eyes wide, mouth stretched open in a silent scream. It was the priest, or what was left of him. My stomach lurched and I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. But then it moved. The body twitched, fingers curling into the carpet. The head snapped toward me, bones cracking with the movement. And those eyes, those empty, hollow eyes locked onto mine. And then it smiled. Not a human smile, something darker, something ancient. The grin stretched far too wide, splitting the face in two, the skin tearing at the edges. It crawled toward me, limbs jerking and twitching, its body dragging itself across the floor like a broken puppet. I turned and ran. Down the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground, the air around me freezing as I raced through the house. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping, shouting, screaming, until it felt like they were inside my head, splitting my skull open with their noise. I reached the front door, fumbling with the lock, my hands slick with sweat. The air behind me shifted and I knew it was there, watching me, laughing at me. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, cold and rancid, like decay and rot. The door swung open, and I stumbled out into the night, the cold air biting into my skin. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my ears. When I finally stopped, I looked back. My house sat in the distance, its windows dark, except for one. The light in my bedroom flickered, on and off, like a beacon in the night. And in the window I saw it, the shadow. Taller now, looming, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It had no face, but I could feel its eyes on me. It was watching. Waiting. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the sound startling me so much I nearly dropped it. Hands shaking, I answered without thinking, my mind still reeling from what I'd just seen. "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper, my throat tight with fear. The voice on the other end was familiar, too familiar. "You can't run," it said, the words distorted, twisted. "Not from this." My blood turned to ice. It was my voice. The person on the other end of the line was me. I dropped the phone, the screen flashing as it hit the pavement, the call still connected. My own voice echoed through the night, laughing, whispering things I couldn't bear to hear. And then the phone went dead. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs trembling beneath me. The street was empty, silent, but I could feel it. The shadow. The thing that had followed me out of that house. It wasn't gone. It would never be gone. I turned and started walking, trying to push the terror from my mind. But as I moved, I realized something else. The shadows on the street, they weren't mine anymore. They were moving on their own, and they were getting closer. I ran. I don't know how long or how far, but I ran until my legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed onto the cold, hard ground. The shadows followed, creeping along the edges of my vision, never fully showing themselves, but always there, always watching. The whispering had stopped by now, replaced with an eerie silence that felt even worse. The night air was freezing, my breath coming out in ragged clouds. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The demon, the priest, the thing that had attached itself to me. It was too much. How could any of this be real? I lay there gasping, eyes scanning the empty street for something, anything that might help. But there was no one, just the cold and the dark. Then something changed. The air shifted, warm for the first time in what felt like days. The shadows that had been creeping in on me stopped, as if frozen in place. I felt a presence behind me, but this time, it wasn't the suffocating malevolence I'd come to fear. No, this felt different. Calmer, warmer. I turned slowly, half expecting to see the shadow again, ready to take me at last. But instead, I saw someone else. David, the boy from the case. He was standing there, his face pale but calm, his eyes no longer filled with the terror I remembered. He looked at me, his lips forming words I couldn't hear, but I understood. He raised a hand, pointing at something behind me. I followed his gaze, turning slowly. There, standing just a few feet away, was the shadow. But something was different now. It wasn't moving, wasn't looming like before. It was shrinking. The edges of its form began to blur, like smoke caught in a breeze. It writhed, struggling to maintain its shape, but it was weakening. I stood up, heart pounding, watching as David stepped closer to the shadow. His hand reached out, and when his fingers touched it, the shadow recoiled, twisting and screeching without sound. I could feel it, the hate, the anger, but it was fading. David's eyes met mine again, and in that moment, I understood what was happening. He was taking it back. The thing that had tormented him, that had tried to destroy his life, it had never let go. It had latched onto me, but now David was reclaiming it. He wasn't afraid anymore. As he stood there, his hand on the shadow, the darkness began to dissolve, breaking apart like ash in the wind. The streetlights flickered back on, the cold lifting from the air, and for the first time in days, I could breathe freely. The shadow was gone. David gave me one last look, a small smile crossing his lips. Then, just as quietly as he had come, he was gone too. The warmth lingered for a moment longer, and then it was just me, standing alone on the street. I didn't know how long I stood there, processing what had just happened. The weight of everything I'd been carrying lifted, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't felt in so long. It was over. The shadow, the demon, whatever it had been, it was gone for good. I went home that night, unsure of what to expect, but when I walked through the door, everything was normal. The air was still. The house was quiet. The whispers had stopped. No more shadows lurking in the corners of my vision. No more cold spots or creaking floorboards, just the familiar comfort of home. I slept through the night for the first time in what felt like months. No nightmares, no visits from things that shouldn't exist. And when I woke up the next morning, sunlight streaming through the windows, I knew it was real. The evil was gone. Days passed, and life began to return to something like normal. The trial faded from the headlines, and people stopped talking about Arne, about David, about the strange and terrifying things that had happened. But I didn't forget. I couldn't. Sometimes, late at night, I think about David, about how he found the strength to face the thing that had haunted him for so long. He had saved me in the end, saved us all. And every now and then, when the night is quiet and the world feels just a little too still, I swear I can feel that warmth again. A reminder that no matter how dark things might get, there's always a way out. And the shadows? They don't scare me anymore.